The 0.7% in South Africa's real domestic product in the second quarter of 2022 has put the country in a weakened state than before the onset of COVID-19. So the decrease in GDP follows growth of 1.7% in the first quarter. 7 industries recorded negative growth between the first and second quarter of 2022. Now, of the 7, the agriculture and mining industries are the biggest contributors to the GDP contraction, having decreased by 7.7% and 5.9% respectively, while mining and quarrying shrank by 3.5%. The decrease is due to severe floods and the energy crisis that have a negative impact on the economy. But Dawie Roodt is with us, the Director and Chief Economist of Efficient, to talk a little bit more about this. So great to have you, Dawie. Thanks so much for getting with us this morning.
Good morning to you. My apologies, some technical issues.
Yeah, no problem. Let's quickly get into it. So an increase of almost 2% in the first quarter, then a shrinkage of almost a percentage point in the second quarter. Expected? I suppose your reaction to it?
Yes, yes, pretty much. Most economists expected a contraction in the second quarter. You mentioned some of the reasons like, for example, a lack of electricity and the floods that we've experienced in the KZN. But I think it's wrong to look at 1 quarter only. 1 quarter is 3 months, but it can be quite volatile. A better number to look at is probably at the 6 months number. And if you look at the 6 months number, then economic growth of around, let's call it 1.5% was reported. Now, that's important to look at because that gives us a better indication of underlying growth potential or underlying growth momentum in the South African economy. And it seems to me as if the underlying growth momentum is roughly about 1.5%. And compare that to the population growth of 1.5%, then it's very clear that we are in deep trouble. So don't put too much emphasis on the second quarter. It was a negative quarter. I think there's a possibility of the third quarter also dipping into a negative, although I don't think so at the moment. So a so-called technical recession is probably not going to happen. But more importantly, it's a slightly longer-term trend, and the slightly longer-term trend clearly indicates that the underlying economic momentum in the economy is far too weak.
Yeah, I mean, some say it's not a complete loss as it follows 2 consecutive quarters of growth, as you've just said, which include almost 2% growth in the first quarter of 2022. So that kind of balancing it out, is that kind of what we're looking at?
No, well, we're getting used to economic growth. Anything above 0 seems to be good. That's not the case, Leon. What we need to aim for is economic growth of 4 or 5%. And we're certainly not going to get to that. We have unemployment levels. We know what the unemployment levels are and the poverty levels are. We know that there are more than 30 million people receiving some sort of social support from the state. And that is simply because the economy is not capable of creating enough jobs and enough wealth creation to support the population in South Africa. So even if the economy is growing at 2 or 3%, it's just not good enough. We need to aim for 4 or 5%. And I'm afraid we're not going to get there. We're not going to get there for a number of reasons. A very important reason has to do with policy uncertainty. We've got a government that is far too interested in Lekotlas and infighting and the election that's around the corner and not interested in running the South African economy. We've got a lack of electricity. We've got a Minister of Trade and Industry putting all sort of obstacles in the way of imports and exports. So in this kind of environment, the economy is not going to grow at the required 4 or 5%.
Yeah. But what's being given as a reason to the negative growth is the KwaZulu-Natal floods that brought a disruption to logistics. We understand that, as well as manufacturing because of damaged factories. And we saw that it had a lot of damage to the economy. But I suppose we also need to know about the ongoing damage that the economy is suffering and suffered at that point as well from the truck blockades in KwaZulu-Natal. That is also something that we need to look at.
All of that has to do with leadership in the end. All of that has to do, are we actually prepared? And there's going to be new floods next year again. Are we prepared to fix that and fix that quickly? This has to do with things like, for example, labor relations. So it has to do with leadership in the end, all of this. And I'm afraid we don't have that in South Africa. And that's, we keep on putting the emphasis on the second quarter. It was a negative quarter. But again, I think more importantly, if we really want to understand what's the underlying potential in the economy, the momentum in the economy, look at the slightly longer term trend. I don't think the third quarter is going to be a negative. Of course, things can still go wrong. We're not at the end of the third quarter yet, but things can still go wrong. I think it's going to be another positive quarter. So we're all very happy that we're probably not going to go into a so-called technical recession, but it is just not good enough. But there were some specific reasons for the second quarter. You mentioned some of those, but that's not an excuse, because we should have had plans in place to fix the damage to infrastructure. We should have had plans in place to manage floods that we experience in South Africa every now and again. There are going to be new floods again, because that's the nature of South Africa. And are we prepared to handle that? And the answer is no. If you look at the number of helicopters available in KZN, I think there's one operational helicopter in KZN. Will there be one or zero when the next flood happens? I've got a suspicion we won't have any helicopters to assist people if the new flood happens, because it is going to happen again. Yeah. We have to plan ahead, and we simply don't.
Out of everything we saw coming in yesterday, I mean, just to, I suppose, explain it to people that don't necessarily watch economics and look at it too much, but for you, what is the most worrying aspect of what we heard?
There are, of course, many things. We've spoken about many of these things that one should be very worried about in South Africa. But there are two aspects that if you stand back a little bit, if we look at the numbers over time, that really, really concern me. Those two aspects are, if you look at the nature of economic activities globally and in South Africa, economic activities are gradually shifting more to the advanced sectors, like, for example, the tertiary sector. In the case of South Africa, we need a lot of economic growth in the secondary sector. That is where manufacturing is. And the reason why is because we've got many, many people that are unemployed. And the best place to employ a lot of people, exactly what the Chinese did, is to get them into factories, to build factories and get them to work into factories. Unfortunately, if you look at the manufacturing sector in South Africa, that used to be the biggest sector in the South African economy 20 odd years or so ago, and today it's number 3 or number 4 or so. And that is something that really, really concerns me. Of course, it's a good thing to be part of the advanced economies, but we need to have a solid industrial base, and we don't have that, and we're actually losing out on that. So that is something that really concerns me. A second thing that concerns me, when you talk about these numbers are very important when you look at wealth creation and employment creation and that sort of stuff. But economic growth numbers are very important for other reasons, for economists and for the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and so on, because we use the size of the economy to express certain ratios. Now, some of these ratios are things like, for example, the fiscal deficit. The fiscal deficit is how much the state spends more than what they get in by way of taxes, and we express that as a percentage of GDP. Another very important number is the fiscal debt as a percentage of GDP. So you can reduce a fiscal debt to GDP ratio by actually reducing the fiscal debt or by growing the economy. And if the opposite happens, like in a shrinking and a contracting economy, while the debt levels remain the same, then the ratio moves in the wrong direction. And that is a major problem in South Africa. The fiscal debt today is in excess of 70% of GDP. And if you add other debt like Eskom and so on to that, then it's around about 80% of GDP. And the reason is because debt has been going up, but also because the economy has been getting smaller, at least in the second quarter. And that's another very important reason why we need to get this economy growing. Unfortunately, institutions like the rating agencies, they also look at these kind of ratios. And when the ratios move in the wrong direction, they will stick up a red flag, and eventually they will decide to downgrade us as well. And that is something that the ordinary people, the man on the street, don't usually look at. But these ratios are very important for a number of other more economic related reasons.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, red flags all over the place. And then, of course, load shedding, adding to that. I mean, let's not forget that during that time, we hit that stage 6. That thing that we haven't, necessarily experienced, and for a long time. And then as a gift, yesterday, we get announced that we've got load shedding as well. Just when you think you may be sort of getting a bit of a reprieve, not a chance. It's back. It's not going anywhere. Yeah. We know that. But, it's impacted not just the country in general, but it is responsible for the great harm that it's doing on sectors that heavily depend on electricity. I mean, where are we on resolving this problem? Where are we? Are we anywhere?
Exactly on sectors like what I've mentioned, the manufacturing industry, but also the mining industry and the like. There's a bit of a silver lining. Well, let's try to see if we can find something positive in here. And the positives, I think, is that if you look at over time, the past 20 years or so, we had a lack of electricity and electricity prices went up sharply, as we all know. And when something becomes scarcer and something becomes more expensive, then people treat it differently. And that's exactly what's been happening to electricity the last, say, 20 years or so, because of a lack of electricity. And let's call it South Africa's electricity productivity improved by between 10 and 20%. So we are actually getting quite good at using the little electricity that we do have and use it quite well. So that, in a way, is a bit of a silver lining. But you're absolutely right. The lack of electricity is keeping a lid on economic growth in South Africa, and rough calculations suggest that the economy anyway cannot grow faster than roughly about 2% continuously because we do not have enough electricity. And what really bothers me, and again, this has to do with political leadership, it took how long? It took how long for Gwede, for example, to allow the private sector to generate 100 megawatts? Why is that so? Allow the private sector to participate in electricity generation and distribution, and this lack of electricity will become less of a problem.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've spoken about these 7 industries that recorded negative growth between the first and second quarter of 2022 and all of the factors around it. But funnily enough, the financial sector, real estate,
Yes.
business services, they had a positive impact on the GDP. So people continue with economic activity despite this high inflation, which is a dampener, and the high food prices, the high fuel prices, the high everything. But there's spending. There is spending happening.
More importantly, and again, I refer back to what I said a little bit earlier, and that is the nature of economies is that they move more to the advanced sectors in the economy. And that is what's happening in South Africa. It's a good thing. We are moving more to the service industry. We're moving more to various services, business services, for example, and of course, finance as well, which is not a bad thing. But you need to fire on all cylinders. And that is not happening. Manufacturing, we need that. And we need mining, we need agriculture. Agriculture is a very volatile sector. I'm not too concerned about agriculture. But what is certainly happening is that the advanced sectors in the economy is doing well, like you've mentioned. And part of the reason has to do with there is a lot of spending, quite a lot actually, left in the South African economy. But much of that has to do with a propped up demand that is being unleashed at the moment in the economy. We find it globally. And of course, a lot of innovation happening in that advanced sectors of the economy. And then perhaps another silver lining before we get too depressed about South Africa's economic numbers. I have a suspicion there's actually far more activities happening in the tertiary sectors that are actually reported. Remember, economic growth, these economic numbers that was reported by Stats South Africa are not what economists call hard numbers. These are estimates. Most economic data are actually estimates. Like inflation numbers is an estimate. We don't really know. We've got a bit of an idea, but we don't have full information. The same goes for GDP numbers. And I've got a suspicion is that there's more economic activities happening in the sectors that you refer to than what is actually reported in the GDP data of Statistics South Africa. Remember, the technology and the techniques and the theory behind GDP keeps on evolving, and that's another reason why they've revisited some of the past data. In the first quarter, for example, that was revised down a little bit because you get more and more data. But the important point is economies are evolving and changing and moving more to the advanced sectors of the economy, and that's quite difficult to capture. But it doesn't mean that the secondary sector or the primary sectors are not important. They are very important as well.
All right, Dawie, we'll leave it there. Thank you. Thanks for chatting to us. Dawie Roodt, he's a Director and Chief Economist of Efficient Group and talking to us about the latest GDP stats released by Stats SA that show a decrease of 0.7% in the second quarter of this year.